The most dangerous person in any prison is rarely the one making the most noise. The heavy steel gates of Blackstone State Prison rolled open with a slow metallic groan as a white transport bus eased through the final security checkpoint beneath a gray October sky. Inside, the newest transfer inmate quietly watched the towering concrete walls rise above layers of razor wire without showing the slightest change in expression. Marcus Ellison, 70 years old, sat with both hands resting comfortably on his knees, his orange prison jumpsuit neatly pressed despite the long ride across nearly 300 miles of highway. His short silver hair framed a weathered face marked by decades of experience rather than defeat, while his calm dark eyes observed every detail around him with remarkable patience. As the bus came to a stop, several younger inmates immediately noticed his age and exchanged amused smiles. One whispered that the old man would probably last less than a week inside Blackstone. Another laughed and suggested he looked more like a retired schoolteacher than someone who belonged in a maximum security prison. Marcus heard every word, yet his expression never changed. He simply stood when instructed, stepped off the bus with steady confidence, and followed the correctional officers through intake processing without complaint. Officer Daniel Harper watched him carefully from behind the security desk. During 20 years working inside Blackstone, he had learned that fear revealed itself in countless ways. Some inmates talked too much. Others refused to make eye contact. Many tried to appear tougher than they truly were. Marcus did none of those things. He answered every question politely, maintained calm eye contact, and spoke only when necessary. Harper quietly made a mental note before directing him toward Housing Unit C. News of the elderly transfer spread through the housing unit long before Marcus reached his assigned cell. Tyler Briggs, the undisputed leader of the most feared inmate group on the block, leaned comfortably against a railing overlooking the common area while several followers gathered nearby. At 42 years old, Tyler carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed respect could only be earned through intimidation. The moment Marcus entered the housing unit carrying a small mesh property bag, Tyler smiled without warmth. "Looks like they finally sent us a grandfather," he joked loudly enough for the entire unit to hear. Laughter echoed across the concrete walls as dozens of inmates turned toward the newcomer. Marcus paused for only a moment before continuing toward his assigned cell at the same measured pace. He neither argued nor hurried. His silence somehow frustrated Tyler more than any insult could have. From the second-floor walkway, Harper noticed the unusual reaction. Most newcomers desperately tried to defend themselves with words. Marcus chose complete composure instead. As evening count approached, and the housing unit slowly settled into its nightly routine, Tyler continued watching the elderly inmate through narrowed eyes. For reasons he could not explain, the quiet old man who refused to react already felt different from anyone Blackstone had ever received, and that single feeling was enough to make him decide that tomorrow, the new transfer would become his first target. Morning arrived with the sharp buzz of the housing unit lights switching on at exactly 6 o'clock, followed by the familiar sound of steel doors unlocking one after another. Marcus Ellison rose from his bunk before the announcement finished, carefully folded his blanket with practiced precision, and straightened the small shelf inside his cell before quietly stepping into the corridor with the other inmates. Nothing about his routine attracted attention, yet everything about it reflected years of unwavering discipline. Tyler Briggs noticed immediately. While most inmates shuffled toward breakfast still half asleep, the elderly transfer walked with steady posture, never rushing and never looking uncertain. Tyler smirked as several members of his group gathered beside him. "Watch this old man," he muttered. "He still thinks manners matter in here." The group laughed softly before following the crowd into the dining hall. Marcus accepted his breakfast tray with a polite nod toward the kitchen worker and chose an empty seat near the far wall instead of joining any table. Around him, conversations echoed through the room, but he remained focused on eating slowly and quietly. Officer Daniel Harper observed the dining hall from the security platform above, occasionally glancing toward the newest inmate. There was something strangely familiar about Marcus's composure. It reminded Harper of experienced military veterans he had met years earlier during a correctional training seminar, men who seemed to measure every room before taking a single step. Later that morning, Counselor Rebecca Collins sat alone inside her office reviewing intake paperwork that had arrived with the previous night's transfers. Marcus Ellison's file rested near the bottom of the stack. She opened it expecting another routine history, but her expression gradually changed as she continued reading. The disciplinary record contained almost nothing despite years of incarceration. Attached to the file were military service documents dating back decades. Marcus had served with distinction in an elite Army combat unit, completed multiple overseas deployments, and later spent years as an instructor responsible for training younger soldiers. Additional commendations described exceptional leadership under pressure, advanced defensive combat instruction, and repeated recognition for protecting fellow service members during dangerous assignments. Rebecca slowly leaned back in her chair. She understood immediately why those records had been placed under restricted access. Inside Blackstone State Prison, almost no one would ever see them. Outside her office, the morning continued exactly as expected. Tyler and his followers laughed loudly in the recreation yard while discussing ways to embarrass the elderly newcomer before the week ended. Marcus quietly volunteered to help move maintenance supplies after breakfast, speaking respectfully to every correctional officer he encountered. No inmate watching him could have imagined the extraordinary experience hidden behind his calm smile. The audience knew the truth now, but inside Blackstone, the elderly transfer remained nothing more than another quiet, old prisoner in the eyes of everyone around him. As Tyler watched Marcus carry a small box of cleaning supplies across the yard without complaint, he smiled with growing confidence, completely unaware that he had chosen the one man inside the prison whose greatest strength had never been winning fights, but knowing exactly when one was not necessary. By the third morning inside Blackstone State Prison, the routine had become predictable for nearly everyone except Marcus Ellison. The loudspeaker announced breakfast, inmates streamed into the corridor, and conversations immediately turned toward the newest transfer. Tyler Briggs made no effort to hide his amusement. Standing beside the second-floor railing with several loyal followers, he watched Marcus leave his cell carrying the same quiet composure he had shown since arriving. "He still walks around like he has somewhere important to be," Tyler joked, drawing laughter from the group. Marcus heard the remark, but continued toward the dining hall without changing his pace. His steady footsteps and relaxed posture somehow irritated Tyler more than open defiance ever could. During breakfast, Marcus noticed a younger inmate struggling to carry an overloaded tray while balancing a pair of paper cups. Without saying a word, Marcus stepped forward, opened the dining hall door, and waited until the young man safely passed through. "Thank you, sir," the inmate said with genuine surprise. Marcus simply smiled. "You are welcome," he replied before returning to his own table. Several nearby inmates quietly observed the exchange. Inside Blackstone, simple kindness often attracted more attention than loud confidence. Later that morning, inmates reported to their assigned work details. Marcus was assigned to the maintenance shop, where he carefully organized tools, repaired damaged storage shelves, and swept the work area with remarkable patience. Every task received the same level of attention whether it required 5 minutes or an hour. The civilian maintenance supervisor quietly told Officer Daniel Harper, "I wish half the crew worked like that, gentleman." Harper glanced toward Marcus without answering. The feeling that something unusual surrounded the elderly inmate continued growing stronger. Meanwhile, Tyler watched from across the corridor as Marcus helped another inmate lift a heavy supply container onto a storage cart. The older man's movements appeared smooth, balanced, and completely controlled despite his age. Nothing seemed rushed. Nothing appeared forced. Tyler frowned slightly before dismissing the thought. "He is just trying to make everyone like him," he muttered. One of his followers nodded in agreement, although his voice carried less confidence than before. During afternoon recreation, Marcus sat alone beneath a large maple tree near the outer fence, quietly reading a worn paperback borrowed from the prison library. Around him, basketball games, conversations, and laughter filled the yard, yet he remained completely focused on the pages in front of him. Counselor Rebecca Collins happened to pass the yard while speaking with another staff member and briefly noticed Marcus reading. Most newly transferred inmates spent their first week trying to establish alliances or avoid attention. Marcus seemed interested in neither. Instead, He behaved like someone who had already learned the value of patience long before entering Blackstone. As recreation ended, Tyler leaned against the exit gate and deliberately blocked the narrow walkway leading back toward the housing unit. Dozens of inmates slowed their pace, quietly expecting another public humiliation for the elderly newcomer. Marcus approached the crowded entrance with the same calm expression he always carried. He looked at Tyler, offered a polite nod, and simply waited without speaking. The silence stretched longer than anyone expected, and for reasons none of the inmates could explain, it was Tyler who became uncomfortable first. The uneasy silence at the recreation yard exit lingered long after Tyler Briggs finally stepped aside. Marcus Ellison acknowledged the opening with nothing more than a courteous nod before walking past at the same measured pace, leaving dozens of inmates exchanging puzzled looks. Tyler watched the elderly man disappear into the housing unit, unable to explain why such a simple moment felt strangely unsettling. He had expected hesitation, fear, or anger. Instead, he had encountered complete patience. That evening, whispers quietly spread across Housing Unit C. Some inmates insisted the old man had no survival instincts. Others believed he possessed unusual confidence. No one agreed on the answer. The following afternoon, the recreation yard buzzed with its usual activity beneath a clear autumn sky. Marcus sat alone on a weathered wooden bench near the walking track, reading the same library book while occasionally looking up to enjoy the cool breeze. Nearby, several inmates played basketball, while others lifted weights or walked slow laps around the yard. Officer Daniel Harper observed everything from the elevated security platform, his attention drifting toward Marcus more often than he cared to admit. Counselor Rebecca Collins crossed the yard carrying paperwork toward the administration building when a sudden shout broke through the routine noise. A basketball had bounced wildly across the concrete after an inaccurate pass, rolling directly toward the outer fence where an older maintenance worker had just opened a service gate to move equipment. At the same moment, a heavily loaded utility cart began rolling down a slight incline after one wheel slipped free of its brake. Most people reacted only after hearing someone yell a warning. Marcus reacted almost instantly. He calmly closed his book, took several smooth steps forward, and reached the cart's handle just before it gathered speed. Without any dramatic movement or visible strain, he guided it safely to a complete stop and gently secured the brake before the cart could reach the open service gate. The entire sequence lasted only a few seconds. There was no panic, no wasted motion, and no excitement on Marcus's face. Once the cart was secure, he simply stepped back and asked the maintenance worker, "Are you all right?" The grateful employee nodded repeatedly while thanking him. Marcus answered with a warm smile before returning to retrieve his book as though nothing unusual had happened. Most inmates barely noticed the incident, dismissing it as good timing. Tyler glanced over briefly, shrugged, and returned to his conversation. Officer Harper, however, continued staring at Marcus long after everyone else had looked away. Years of experience told him that what he had witnessed was not luck. The elderly inmate had assessed the situation, chosen the safest path, and acted with remarkable efficiency before anyone else fully understood the danger. Later that evening, Harper quietly mentioned the incident to Counselor Collins. She listened carefully before opening Marcus's restricted file once again. As she reread the pages describing decades of military service, advanced combat instruction, and leadership under pressure, the pieces began fitting together more clearly. Neither Harper nor Collins spoke another word, but both arrived at the same silent conclusion. The quiet transfer inmate was revealing fragments of a past that the rest of Blackstone State Prison had not even begun to imagine, and sooner or later someone besides the staff was going to notice. The atmosphere inside Housing Unit C shifted in subtle ways over the next several days. Conversations still stopped when Marcus Ellison walked past, but the laughter had grown quieter and the curious glances had become more frequent. He continued following the same routine every morning, greeting correctional officers with respect, completing every assigned task without complaint, and spending his free time either reading or helping wherever an extra pair of hands was needed. His consistency made him impossible to understand. Tyler Briggs disliked mysteries, especially ones that quietly challenged his authority without saying a single word. He gathered several members of his group near the dayroom windows and nodded toward Marcus, who was carefully organizing returned library books onto a small cart for an inmate volunteer. "He is putting on a show," Tyler said confidently. "Nobody stays that calm all the time." One of the younger inmates hesitated before answering. "Maybe that is just who he is." Tyler immediately dismissed the suggestion. Everyone breaks eventually. Later that afternoon, Tyler decided it was time to prove his point. As inmates moved through the corridor after work assignments, he stepped directly into Marcus's path with an easy smile that carried more challenge than friendliness. The hallway gradually became quieter as nearby inmates slowed their pace without appearing obvious. Even Officer Daniel Harper, standing at the far end of the corridor, sensed that something unusual was unfolding. Tyler folded his arms and looked directly into Marcus's eyes. "You have been here almost a week," he said. "You smile, you read books, and you help everybody. Tell me something. Do you think being polite is going to earn you respect in this place?" Marcus met his gaze without the slightest hint of irritation. "Respect cannot be demanded," he answered calmly. "It has to be chosen." Several inmates exchanged surprised looks. Tyler chuckled as though amused by the answer. "That sounds like something from a fortune cookie." Marcus smiled gently. "Good advice does not become less valuable because someone laughs at it." A few inmates quietly lowered their heads to hide unexpected smiles. Tyler noticed immediately. The conversation was no longer unfolding the way he had planned. He took a slow step closer, expecting Marcus to retreat or become uncomfortable. Instead, Marcus remained completely relaxed, his breathing steady and his posture unchanged. There was no challenge in his expression and no fear either. It was simply the quiet confidence of someone who felt no need to impress anyone. The silence stretched across the corridor until Tyler finally shook his head with a forced laugh. "You really believe all that?" Marcus answered without hesitation. "I spent many years learning that the strongest decision is often the one that prevents regret tomorrow." Tyler searched the elderly man's face for signs of uncertainty, but found none. He stepped aside with a shrug, pretending the conversation had meant nothing, yet the feeling followed him long after Marcus continued down the corridor. From across the hallway, Officer Harper had heard every word. Counselor Rebecca Collins later listened as Harper described the exchange, and both reached the same conclusion without speaking it aloud. Marcus had defeated neither an argument nor an opponent. He had quietly taken control of the moment simply by refusing to surrender his patience. And for the first time since arriving at Blackstone, Tyler Briggs began wondering whether the quiet old man understood him far better than he understood the quiet old man. The next week brought colder mornings and longer work assignments. Yet Marcus Ellison followed the same quiet routine that had already become familiar throughout Blackstone State Prison. He arrived on time, completed every task with care, and treated every person, whether inmate or correctional officer, with equal respect. His consistency slowly changed the atmosphere around him. Conversations no longer centered on how long the elderly transfer would survive inside the prison. Instead, inmates began asking one another why nothing ever seemed to disturb him. Tyler Briggs refused to accept the growing curiosity. From his perspective, Marcus represented a challenge that could not be ignored. A man who inspired questions without demanding attention threatened the influence Tyler had spent years building. During an afternoon work detail near the maintenance storage building, Tyler noticed Ethan Parker struggling to push a supply cart loaded with cleaning materials and replacement light fixtures. Ethan was one of the youngest inmates in Housing Unit C, eager to avoid trouble and often overwhelmed by assignments that older prisoners completed with ease. As the cart reached a narrow ramp, one of the front wheels caught on a cracked section of concrete, causing several boxes to shift toward the edge. Ethan froze for a brief moment, unsure whether to hold the cart or let it roll backward. Before anyone else reacted, Marcus calmly stepped forward. Without raising his voice or creating a scene, he placed one hand against the side of the cart, steadied its movement, and quietly showed Ethan how to reposition the wheels before continuing up the incline. The entire moment lasted less than half a minute. "Keep your weight behind the handle," Marcus said with an encouraging smile. "Slow is usually faster than rushing." Ethan nodded gratefully. "Thank you. I almost lost the whole load." Marcus simply replied, "Everyone needs someone to lend a hand now and then." Officer Daniel Harper observed the exchange from several yards away. There was nothing extraordinary about helping another inmate with a heavy cart. Yet Marcus had recognized the problem almost before it developed and solved it with effortless precision. Harper remembered the reports describing military instructors who taught younger recruits to remain calm under pressure. The resemblance was becoming impossible to ignore. Tyler had witnessed the same scene from across the workyard. He had expected Marcus to avoid involvement, but instead the elderly inmate had quietly earned another measure of respect without asking for it. Even several inmates standing nearby offered Ethan approving smiles before returning to their own assignments. Later that evening in the housing unit, Ethan thanked Marcus again for the advice. Marcus answered with the same humility he always displayed. "One day you will help someone else," he said. "That is how good habits spread." Those simple words carried farther than either man realized. Nearby inmates exchanged thoughtful glances, and for the first time, some of Tyler's own followers appeared more interested in listening to Marcus than laughing at him. Tyler noticed the subtle shift immediately. He did not see fear in their faces. He saw respect beginning to grow, and he understood that respect was far more difficult to reclaim once it started belonging to someone else. Quietly, he decided that patience had accomplished nothing, and whatever happened next would have to force Marcus Ellison to reveal the man he had been trying so carefully to keep hidden. The balance inside Housing Unit C continued changing in ways that were almost impossible to measure, yet impossible to ignore. Marcus Ellison never asked anyone to follow him, never offered long speeches, and never attempted to influence the people around him. Even so, more inmates found reasons to greet him each morning, and more correctional officers noticed that the areas where Marcus worked somehow operated with fewer complaints and less tension. Tyler Briggs recognized the shift before anyone else because it affected him directly. Conversations that once stopped when he approached now sometimes continued, and several members of his own circle had begun speaking about the elderly transfer with quiet admiration rather than ridicule. Tyler decided it was time to remind everyone who still controlled the housing unit. During an afternoon recreation period, a group of inmates gathered near the outdoor exercise area while others walked laps around the yard beneath bright sunshine. Ethan Parker had been assigned to organize sports equipment before returning it to the storage cage. As he struggled to stack several awkward containers onto a rolling rack, one of the upper bins slipped unexpectedly, causing the tall stack to lean dangerously toward another inmate standing nearby. Before anyone had time to shout a warning, Marcus calmly stepped forward. His movement was smooth, efficient, and almost effortless. With one hand, he stabilized the rolling rack before it gathered momentum, while his other hand guided the loose container back into place with remarkable precision. There was no panic, no wasted motion, and no appearance of physical strain. The entire sequence ended almost as quickly as it had begun. Marcus simply looked at Ethan and smiled. "Always secure the heaviest items first," he said in the calm voice of an experienced instructor. "The lighter ones become much easier afterward." Ethan nodded with appreciation. "I will remember that. Thank you." Several inmates, standing only a few feet away, exchanged puzzled glances. One quietly whispered, "Did you see how fast he moved?" Another answered, "He made it look easy." Tyler heard every word. For the first time since Marcus arrived, uncertainty crossed his face. He replayed the moment in his mind, realizing that the elderly inmate had recognized the problem before anyone else and solved it without hesitation. Officer Daniel Harper noticed the same thing from the observation platform. He had spent years watching thousands of inmates react to unexpected situations, and Marcus had responded with the same controlled efficiency that appeared throughout his military records. Later that afternoon, Harper mentioned the incident to Counselor Rebecca Collins. Rebecca remained silent for several seconds before quietly closing Marcus's restricted file. "The reports describe someone who trained others to stay calm under pressure," she said. "Today I think we finally saw part of that training with our own eyes." Harper slowly nodded. Neither of them intended to share what they knew, but both understood that the truth was beginning to reveal itself without anyone opening the file. Back in the housing unit, Tyler watched Marcus thank Ethan for helping return the equipment, even though Marcus had done most of the work himself. That simple act troubled Tyler more than anything else. Confidence without pride was unfamiliar territory, and respect earned without demanding it was even harder to challenge. As evening count approached, Tyler quietly reached a decision. The next conversation with Marcus Ellison would not be a casual exchange, because he had become determined to discover exactly who the quiet old man really was. The following morning carried an unusual sense of anticipation throughout Housing Unit C. No announcement had been made, and no rules had changed, yet inmates seemed to watch Marcus Ellison more closely than ever before. He noticed the extra attention without acknowledging it, greeting Officer Daniel Harper with the same polite nod before reporting to his maintenance assignment. Tyler Briggs stood nearby with folded arms, carefully observing every movement the elderly inmate made. He had spent several days searching for signs of weakness and found only patience. That answer no longer satisfied him. During the afternoon, Blackstone welcomed a small group of visitors participating in a volunteer veterans outreach program approved by the administration. Most inmates paid little attention as the visitors met with staff members near the education building, but one gray-haired guest suddenly stopped walking after catching sight of Marcus carrying maintenance supplies across the courtyard. The visitor stared for several seconds before speaking softly to Counselor Rebecca Collins. "Excuse me," he said. "Is that Marcus Ellison?" Rebecca looked surprised. "You know him?" The visitor smiled with unmistakable respect. "Know him. 25 years ago, he trained half the instructors at Fort Benning. I attended one of his leadership courses before my final deployment. He was the calmest man I ever met, and probably the best instructor I ever had." Rebecca remained silent, allowing the words to settle. Officer Harper, standing only a few feet away, quietly listened as the visitor continued. "Marcus always told us that real strength begins with discipline, and discipline begins with patience. He could teach an entire room without raising his voice once." Harper immediately remembered the same steady composure Marcus displayed every day inside Blackstone. Nothing about it had been accidental. As the conversation ended, the visitor politely asked whether he could briefly greet Marcus. Prison policy did not allow informal contact, so Rebecca apologized and explained the restrictions. The visitor simply nodded with understanding before leaving one final message. "Please tell him that Captain William Mercer still remembers every lesson he taught." Marcus never heard those words. He continued his assignment, completely unaware that someone from his past had just confirmed everything hidden inside his restricted file. Later that evening, Harper quietly shared the encounter with Rebecca inside the administration office. Neither officer discussed Marcus with other staff members, but stories had a way of spreading through any prison. By the next afternoon, fragments of the conversation had reached several inmate workers responsible for cleaning administrative corridors. Before long, whispers moved from one housing unit to another. Some inmates claimed the elderly transfer had trained soldiers. Others believed he had served as a military instructor. A few exaggerated the stories even further. Tyler dismissed the rumors at first, yet doubt continued growing each time he looked at Marcus. The quiet confidence, the precise movements, the measured words, and the refusal to seek recognition suddenly formed a picture that Tyler could no longer ignore. For the first time since Marcus arrived at Blackstone State Prison, Tyler did not see an easy target standing across the day room. He saw a man whose past had earned genuine respect long before either of them had ever walked through the prison gates, and he realized that everyone else was beginning to see the same thing. Several weeks after Marcus Ellison first arrived at Blackstone State Prison, the atmosphere inside Housing Unit C felt noticeably different. Nothing official had changed. The schedules remained the same. The steel doors still echoed through the corridors each morning, and the loudspeaker continued announcing every movement with perfect routine. Yet respect had quietly replaced ridicule. Inmates who had once laughed at the elderly transfer now greeted him with simple nods as they passed. Some asked for advice about books from the prison library. Others sought his opinion before making difficult decisions. Marcus never acted like a leader, but people naturally trusted someone whose actions always matched his words. Tyler Briggs noticed the change more than anyone. One afternoon, after work assignments had ended, he approached Marcus in the day room without the confident grin that had once accompanied every encounter. Several inmates looked up from card games and conversations, curious to see what would happen next. Tyler stopped a few feet away and remained silent for several moments before finally speaking. "I heard some stories about you," he admitted. Marcus looked up from the book resting in his hands and smiled politely. Stories often become larger each time they are repeated. Tyler gave a quiet laugh. Maybe, but I also heard enough to know that I judged you before I knew anything about you. Marcus closed his book without rushing. That happens more often than people realize. The simple answer caught Tyler by surprise. He had expected criticism or satisfaction. Instead, Marcus offered neither. You are not angry? Tyler asked. Marcus slowly shook his head. Carrying anger for too long only gives it a permanent place to live. I have already carried enough weight in my lifetime. The words settled over the room with unexpected silence. Even inmates pretending not to listen found themselves paying attention. Tyler looked around the dayroom before returning his eyes to Marcus. I spent years believing respect came from making people afraid of me. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. Fear can make people obey for a while. Respect makes them choose to stand beside you. Tyler remained quiet, considering the difference. Finally, he extended his hand. Marcus accepted the gesture with a firm but gentle handshake that lasted only a moment. No applause followed. No dramatic announcement marked the occasion. The significance rested entirely in its simplicity. Officer Daniel Harper witnessed the exchange from the observation station and exchanged a brief glance with Counselor Rebecca Collins, who happened to be walking through the corridor. Neither of them needed to say anything. They had watched patients accomplish what force never could. As evening count concluded and inmates returned to their cells, Marcus paused beside the narrow window overlooking the prison yard. Beyond the outer fence, the setting sun cast long shadows across the concrete. At that same moment, the distant sound of another transport bus echoed through the prison entrance. Several correctional officers turned toward the front gate as a new transfer vehicle slowly rolled through the security checkpoint. Marcus quietly watched the bus for only a second before returning to his cell with the same calm expression he had worn since the day he arrived, unaware that another unfamiliar face was about to enter Blackstone carrying a past that no one inside the prison could possibly imagine.